All right, welcome to those who are here in person. Welcome to those who are here later asynchronously. Glad you're all here. Our topic today is the greatest blessing of them all, the gift of love. And so here we go. All right, class 13, marriage, love, and they call it kosher sex, right? And so the rabbis acknowledge, right, that like first of all, kashrut, kosher means the right way to do it, right? It doesn't just say kosher as kosher eating, the right way to eat, and kosher sex is, we have guidance in Judaism about everything. And so Judaism doesn't just stay in the synagogue. It's not just about the Passover Seder. It's about everything that we do, right? There's a Jewish way to open the door for people. There's a Jewish way to greet people, with a friendly face. There's a Jewish way to do everything, right? And so when we talk about marriage and love and sex, there is a Jewish way to do all that. So we're going to learn about relationships. We're going to learn about the wedding. And we're going to learn about all kinds of things. And so I want to acknowledge, first of all, let's put it into. Hold on a minute and put it into. How's that? Does that look okay? Is it smaller? Well, that's better, right? Okay, here we go. So there's a Jewish kosher way to do everything. And the first text we're going to see is sort of a common text that people use. It's a little weird. I have to acknowledge that before we look at it. But it teaches an important lesson so we can rise above. All right, so here we go. Rav Kahana was a student of Rav. So these are two rabbis. One evening, he came and hid under his bed. He observed how Rav conversed with his wife, made her laugh, and then started to have sex. Rav Kahana cried out, and Rav was startled. Kahana, are you here? Get out. You don't belong here, said the teacher. Rav Kahana answered, this too is Torah, and I must learn it. A little weird, right? And we acknowledge that he shouldn't have been there, because the Rav said, get out of here, you don't belong here. So there's an acknowledgement that it is weird and sort of inappropriate. However, it proves the point really well that the student really wanted to know how to do it well, right? And he did learn. He learned that you do it with gentle, with conversation, with laughter and joy first, right? And then, right, comes the sex, right? And so that teaches us two things. One is this too is Torah, right? The Torah isn't just the 5 books of Moses. The Torah is everything, right? And so this too is Torah, and I must learn it. But he was desperate to learn, the Jewish way of sexuality. And again, inappropriate, and Rav kicked him out of there, but it proves the point really well. And it's a text that you should know because a lot of people use it. And so it's a pretty common text. Okay. I, it, and I, thou. This is a very important concept in Judaism. Martin Buber, 1923. And Martin Buber was one of our great philosophers in conservative Judaism. It's really Buber and Heschel are the two greatest modern philosophers. Abraham Joshua Heschel brings us the voice of the prophets, advocacy, intense Jewish ritual. And Martin Buber brings us relationship. And his book is called I, Thou. right? And it's a little confusing because thou in King James language means you. It's the personal way to address the king. It's the personal way to address people. It's a more intimate way. And so on the left side of the spectrum, you can see I, it, and on the right side, I, thou. Right? And so we relate to the world in two major ways, I, it, or I, thou. And those are in every place in between. So what's I, it? I, it is when people become functions, right? So the bagger at the supermarket, the guy who cleans up around the apartment complex, right? And sometimes we acknowledge them, sometimes we don't, sometimes it's a nod, right? But so that's an I-it relationship. And it's also has to do with nature, the natural world, right? We sometimes relate to all the world around us as, for us, it's a resource for us to use, right? And so when we think about use or using people, right? We sort of know that that's a negative concept. That's the I-it relationship, right? The world is just here for us to use. People are here just for us to interact with and get what we need from them. And so that's an I-it relationship, right? It's not even a person. We don't even acknowledge the inner beauty or really inner anything about the person or the thing or nature, the tree, right? That we're in relationship with. On the other side of the spectrum is I, thou, right? And I, thou is a respectful relationship. And it's a relationship in which we don't have an agenda, right? We don't want something from people. It's it's about relating to people on the deepest level possible, which is all the preconceptions, all the prejudices are left behind, right? This is where real and true feelings will emerge, right? And it's not scripted, right? It's not about, right, handing over your credit card and getting something back. It's not a mere exchange of utility. It's an intimate relationship. And one of the keys is not having an agenda, right? So usually when we approach people, you want something from them, right? And you have an agenda and you want something to happen, right? It sort of goes along scripted almost. An I-thou relationship is open and spontaneous. All you want to do is kind of spend time with the person, and then something will arise, right? If you're listening well, if you're open, if you ask, questions, leading questions, tell me about yourself, right? That's an I-thou relationship rather than an I-it relationship. And of course, we should always be striving with everything around us for that I-you, right? I-thou relationship, which is the proper way to be in the world, the proper way to be in a relationship, right? Even between spouses, right? Sometimes we need something from them, right? And it's sort of a functional relationship. We want to avoid that as much as possible and just be open to care, to love, and to cherish, right? The moments that we have together without an agenda, just sitting and being, right? So that's the I-it, I-thou relationship, which Buber tries to help us understand. And it's hard, right? But when I've put it in my consciousness a little bit, right? So there are the maintenance people around my apartment complex, and I make a point, right, of knowing their names, of saying hello, of saying thank you when I see them, just based on this, just based on my learning with Martin Buber that in rabbinical school, right? It's really affected the way I think about things and relate to people. And so, right, that's one small step, right, that we can do is when we see maintenance people, when we see people, service industry people, you want to acknowledge their humanity, right? That's a very important thing. That's the first step, right? The relationship piece is more difficult and more complex, but that's at least something we can try to incorporate into our lives. All right, so here we go. We're going to talk a little bit about sex in general, and then marriage and the values that we have, right? And usually, right, right, even in our teenage years, right? It's difficult sometimes to have real, genuine, truthful relationships. And as we grow older, we hope that we learn how to do relationships better, particularly in a marriage. And so in general, Judaism, like everything else in the world, Judaism embraces sexuality. Right? So in other religions, in other religions, right, the sex is bad, right? Lust is bad, and refraining is the holiest thing you can do, right? Monks up on top of a mountain, right, and all, right, and priests, right? So I don't want to bash any other religions, but in Judaism, what makes us, I think, unique is our embrace of sexuality. Right? We have a soul that we tend to and we care about, and we also have bodies that are also holy. Right? The soul is here before we're born; it's here after we pass. But our bodies are also, even though they're temporary, they're on loan from God, and therefore they're holy. And what we do with our bodies is also holy. And so, right, all of our being serves God. Right? And sex is not considered base or obscene, right? And there are real values that go into sexuality. Here are just a few. Modesty, right? It's important that we don't flaunt our sexuality, or modesty is more than dress. It's also a way of being in the world. Right? Respect, right? Every time that we're together and intimate, right, there has to be a level of respect, of mutuality, right, and kindness, right, as we saw in the Rav Kahana Rav story, right. There has to be a real relationship there, not just an I-it relationship, but an I-thou relationship. Another value that we use is honesty, right, and that comes really from dating, right? You should, oh, I love you, you're the only one, and then have multiple relationships at the same time. Right? And so, right, as long as you're honest, right, that's the key. Safety, right? We want to make sure that everyone stays safe, and that's another value of what we have. So another issue that we have is premarital sex, right? So how does Judaism feel about that? And this comes from Rabbi Elliot Dorff, who wrote a book, a pamphlet on sexuality. And what he posits is the preferred place for sexuality is marriage. However, right, we know, and we might as well embrace the idea of premarital sex. And the same rules apply: honesty, modesty, respect, safety, right? All of these things are still applicable, right? Normally we sort of ignore it and say, yeah, it happens, it doesn't happen, you're on your own. But Judaism has values to imbue dating before marriage with the same values that we have post-marriage. What does Judaism say about same-sex relationships, right? Baruch Hashem, thank God. The Reform movement and the conservative movement have grappled with the idea over the decades. And now we are completely inclusive of same-sex relationships and same-sex marriages. About a year, no, maybe 2 years ago, I was asked to perform my first gay wedding. And it was fascinating because I had to translate, make decisions about the rituals and about the text and the blessings that I would recite. And I worked with the couple and came up with a really beautiful ceremony, and it worked. And so same-sex relationships should be seen as equal to heterosexual relationships in our communities, both through marriage and right, integrating them into the community. Right. So sex is one of the beautiful gifts that God gave to us, and it can be used just like anything else, harshly or beautifully. And so the prayer is that we enjoy God's gift and appreciate the guidelines and the values that we imbue into sexuality. All right, so let's get into the Jewish wedding. Here we go. All right, are we good? Looks like it. Okay. Oh, not yet. Okay, wrong one. Sorry. Okay, one more time. That one comes later. That's my calendar. I can do this. I've even practiced. Bear with me. There we go.
Attending a Jewish wedding? Like a cake, the basic ingredients stay the same, but everyone's got their own special twist on the recipe. The flour, eggs, and milk of the ceremony are the Ketubah, ring, and 7 blessings.
I make flourless cakes.
Moving on, the Ketubah is a signed and witnessed marriage contract. The ring represents an exchange of something of value, and the 7 blessings each thank God in a different way. There are so many variations on the recipe. Some common traditions.
Tishes, or separate pre-parties. A Bedeckin, the veiling ceremony. Couples circling each other. A chuppah held up by family members. Smashing a glass. Dancing the hora. Entertaining the newlyweds.
Some couples also include special family customs, uniquely Ashkenazi or Sephardic traditions, interfaith and multicultural twists, and their own personal vows. From the most traditionally observant to the most creative hybrid, these ceremonies all celebrate companionship, and each one is delicious. Gluten-free wedding cake.
All right, cute.
Jewish weddings take place under a canopy called a chuppah, which creates a spiritually charged area during the ceremony. The canopy itself can be made of almost anything. Some couples use a tallis that was important to their family, or a quilt made of squares contributed by guests, or just some pretty fabric that complements someone's special size. It is attached to 4 poles, often decorated with flowers or ribbons. Many couples honor close friends by asking them to hold the chuppah. Standing under the chuppah is a symbolic act of intimacy. It demonstrates a couple's intention.
Rabbi, we're not.
Yeah.
Okay.
New life
Working
together.
on it here.
The chuppah,
Okay.
open on all 4 sides, invites the community to be part of the couple's future.
There we go. Google Chrome. Okay, stop. And we're back. Okay. All right. Leading up to the wedding day, the mikvah is an important view slideshow. The mikvah is an important lead up to the wedding. So what's important about the mikvah? Okay, one more. We'll get a different view. All right, this will work. The lead up to the wedding is one of the ceremonies that we do is the mikvah, an immersion into a ritual bath to physically and spiritually prepare for the holiness of the wedding day. As I mentioned before, body and soul And so our bodies go into the mikvah, and it's a refresher for the soul, right? It gets us spiritually and emotionally prepared for the holiness of the wedding day, right? And so our rabbis teach that the preparation for something is even more important than the thing itself, right? And so the moment of preparation is we immerse ourselves, body and soul, into a ritual bath, into the mikvah. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Ufruf, a celebration of an engaged couple on the Shabbat before the wedding day. And so sometimes when it's on a Sunday, you'll do it the week before. But the ufruf it's a strange word. It's a Yiddish word. And what it does is allows the community that you're in to enjoy celebrating with the bride and the groom. Right? Oftentimes you can't invite everybody in your synagogue community. And so this provides an opportunity for the synagogue community to embrace the couple. And it's a very beautiful thing. All right, the wedding day itself. It starts with what we call the Bedeckin and signing the Ketubah. And the Bedeckin usually takes place about a half an hour before the wedding itself. And it's usually only sort of close friends and family. And we do two things. One is sign the Ketubah, right? And then we'll read it under the chuppah. But we sign the Ketubah right before the wedding begins, before the chuppah, and also do a Bedeckin. So the ceremony immediately prior to the processional, in which the bride is veiled, right? And so the groom veils the bride, right? And so there's usually two veils. One stays in the back and one goes on the front. And so why do we do it? There's a story in the Torah that I don't use, but a lot of people do use, which is Rachel and Leah. When Jacob wants to marry Rachel, Lavan, the father, tricks Jacob and gives him Leah instead. Why? Because she was the firstborn. And so after 7 years, he was waiting to get married to Rachel, and Lavan switched. And so this ceremony allows the groom to make sure that it's who he is wanting to marry. I don't use that one, and it doesn't quite make sense because we're veiling the bride instead of unveiling the bride. What I tell the couple is veiling is a sign of holiness. And so the Torah in the ark is veiled. The challah on the Shabbat table is veiled. And veiling means this is distinct and holy. And so the veiling of the bride takes place in this Ketubah signing ritual before the wedding. Then the wedding itself takes place under a chuppah. You can see a beautiful chuppah there. That's kind of a simple chuppah. It has 4 poles, a talit on the top. Sometimes it's a talit that's in the family, a family heirloom, or a new talit bought for this occasion. Then you've got the flowers on the bottom, which makes it very nice. Traditionally, by the way, they're chuppah holders. You have 4 people each holding one of the chuppah. But here you see they're sort of planted into the planters. Here's the Ketubah. The Ketubah is an ancient Aramaic text, and it outlines the terms of commitment between the 2 partners. Right? And the Aramaic is sort of confusing and complex and ancient. We still use it because we're traditionalists, and especially at this moment of holiness and tradition, and generation to generation, we want to include some of that traditional Aramaic texts. However, the English translation isn't a legal part of the Ketubah, and so therefore it can be creative and lovely and contemporary translation. Signatures of 2 witnesses. So at the bottom there, you can see some lines. You've got the bride and the groom, which actually aren't technical legal necessity, but then you got 2 witnesses. Those are the important ones, and you choose non-related people. They shouldn't be sisters, brothers, uncles, and aunts. Why? Because you really want the witnesses to be unbiased, right? And so it's actually a legal witness, and so they can't be related. And then these days, typically, the couple chooses some artwork that goes with the Ketubah. And here you see a beautiful circle. It's surrounded by paper cut, I think. And sometimes it stands on the wall in your new home. Under the chuppah. So what happens under the chuppah? Well, you've got the kiddushin, which is the exchange of rings. There's actually two parts. The kiddushin is the first part, and the erusin. This is the exchange of rings and the declarations. Harei at mekudeshet li, hereby betrothed, my beloved. And so there's an exchange of rings, and there's an exchange of words, of declarations, which sanctifies the couple to one another and formally binds them in matrimony. Right? So that's the ring exchange, along with the formula that is recited. The Sheva Brachot, the 7 blessings, are recited over a cup of wine, and the text comes from the Talmud. And even though it's an ancient text, it still, I think, retains some of its beauty in the contemporary world. So the first one is a Borei Pri HaGafen, a blessing of the wine, because we celebrate everything over wine, right? And my cup overfloweth, right? And so wine is a symbol of joy and blessing. And then we praise God for the opportunity and the willingness for two people to come into marriage and commit themselves for life to one another. Thank you, God, for creating humanity is the third blessing. Thank you, God, for allowing us to set up a home together. And then it talks about blessings of joy. And not only is the couple rejoicing and the community rejoicing, but the whole world, right, rejoices at this essential and joyful moment. And then the 7th blessing is, right, I'll read it a little bit from the text. Praised are you, Adonai, our God, who rules the universe, who creates joy and gladness, bride and groom, pleasure, song, delight, laughter, love, harmony, peace, and companionship. Right, the blessing overflows with joy. May there always be heard in the cities of Judah and the streets of Jerusalem and all the world, voices of joy and gladness, of happiness, voices of brides and grooms, the jubilant voices of those joined in marriage under the chuppah, the voices of young people feasting and singing. Praised are you, Adonai, who causes groom and bride to rejoice together. That's the last bracha. And, it's quite beautiful and sung with a very distinct melody. And finally, the concluding ceremony is where we break the glass and everybody says Mazel Tov, right? And there's a video here that I'm not going to play due to technical difficulties, and I'll describe it instead. Right? So one recommendation that I always use for the couple is to get a cheap glass. Why a cheap glass? Because what makes expensive glass expensive is that it's hard to break, right? And so it's heavy. And so get a cheap glass is actually a trade secret, which is instead of using an actual glass, to use a light bulb, right? And so the light bulb is easily smashed and it makes a really nice pop, right? And so that's a recommendation. And why do we do it? Why do we break a glass at the end of a Jewish wedding? There are like 100 reasons. I have a congregant who listed, 70 reasons, did some research why we break a glass. Here's the reason that I embrace is at this moment of joy, it's important to remember that there's still some brokenness and pain in the world. And there's a rabbinic story that at a wedding, one of the rabbis took a crystal bowl and smashed it right on the floor for that reason, because he felt like it was getting too ecstatic, too out of control, and decided, you know what, we need a little more balance, even when we're rejoicing, so that we can remember that we're no longer living, we're not living in a world that's complete and whole. So even in this moment of joy, we still want to remember that there are people suffering and in pain. Right? And so that provides us with a little bit of balance. These days, right, even if you don't have in mind that kind of balance, it's still just a beautiful, joyful moment. Mazel tov, and the couple is officially married. But not yet. There's one more ritual that takes place in a traditional wedding, which is the ritual of yichud, a few moments of private time shared by the couple immediately following the ceremony. It's a chance to breathe, to look at each other in the eyes, and acknowledge the intensity and immensity of a grandeur of what just happened. Right? And there's a practical aspect, because once you get out into the public, right, you're greeting and you're dancing, and you really don't have time to actually eat. And so traditionally, there's some food brought in and water to hydrate, to prepare the wedding couple to greet the public and enjoy the evening. What's not mentioned here is that the yichud back in the day was a time to consummate the wedding, and but these days we don't encourage that. It's just a time to breathe. But we wait a certain amount of time, 8 minutes, 10 minutes, to allow them to really spend the time together. And traditionally, the time it takes to consummate. And so there's some debate of how much time that is. But we have about 10 minutes. And we place shomrim, guards at the door, to make sure that no one goes in or out. Right? And the guards are, friends and family. And it's, kind of fun. But it actually is necessary, for most weddings, because the photographer wants to get in there and the wedding planner wants to get in there. And it's important that they just spend this time together without interruption. All right, the mikvah. Right, so the mikvah is a little bit of background on the mikvah. Mikvah is a living body of water. And so back in the day, it was rainwater that filled the mikvah. However, these days, when it's hard to keep up the sanitary aspects of it, to put some chlorine in there. So how do you do that? How do you do a living water in a room? Right? And so you can see this beautiful mikvah. Normally they do look a little bit like a spa if you choose the right ones. And as you can see, there's a staircase that leads down into the holy water. And that room over there on the right is likely a changing room. So there's a private room that people go into to disrobe, and going into the mikvah like a baby in the womb, right? And just to totally be embraced by the water. And when you go for your wedding, you don't need like witnesses or anybody to come with you. In the Orthodox community, when you're going monthly, like in your monthly cycle, there's off times in intimacy, and there's on times in intimacy. And when it comes back to be on times for intimacy, that's traditionally when women will visit the mikvah. So how do you make sure that it's living water? One of the ways to do that is to have a pipe. Okay, it's probably below ground there. In the United Orthodox Synagogue mikvah, there's the second body of water, which is natural water, which is rainwater. And there's a point where they connect. Right? And so as long as the chlorinated treated water is connected to the other natural body of water, then it's still considered a natural body of water. I'll take questions in a minute. What is a mikvah? And so here's an ancient mikvah. You can find them on top of Masada. You can find them all over Israel and beyond. So we know this is an ancient ritual that people use to purify themselves, right? Sometimes people use the term clean and unclean. That's not really the point. The point is more purity and impurity. How do you become impure? One of the ways is contact with life and death. Right? So, for example, we have hand washing at a cemetery. When you leave a cemetery, the tradition is to wash your hands, right? Because you've come into contact with life and death. In this case, life. And so that's when you become spiritually impure, and the mikvah purifies, right? The water, the living waters purify the body and the soul. So what is a mikvah? Any natural body of water, provided it's deep enough for a person to immerse their entire body fully. The ocean is also a mikvah. It's a little bit harder to get into because right, you're supposed to go in without clothing. So that's why it's done in the privacy of a room. A human-made mikvah is connected to a naturally flowing source of water called mayim chayim, rainwater, underground spring, or even melting ice blocks. Right? If you live in a geographic area where it just doesn't rain very often, right? One of the secrets is to bring ice blocks from other places, ship in some ice blocks, and they can melt into a special room, and then you can connect that room to the mikvah itself. Why use a mikvah? Right, so one of the ways we use a mikvah is conversion to Judaism. It's sort of a rebirth, right? You're still connected with your biological family, of course, but in terms of your religion, in terms of Judaism, this is a rebirth of religion. And so right, many religions also right, use the waters of the mikvah, baptism, and right, conversion. And so we're in line with other religions that use the water for religious transitions, marked life transitions. And there are other ways to use the mikvah: birthdays, before marriage, recovering from an illness, before, during, after pregnancy, following a trauma or a loss, right? And so there are also alternative contemporary ways to use the mikvah other than the Orthodox tradition of going monthly following menstruation. Taharat mishpacha, so there you go, following the cessation of a menstrual period prior to resuming sexual relations. Right? And so almost all the mikvahs are used for that purpose. Here at United Orthodox Synagogues, anybody is welcome to use the mikvah during the day, but at night it's reserved for Taharat mishpacha. Preparation for a major holiday, particularly high holidays and Pesach. I myself use it for preparation for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. I write all my sermons and I do all my preparation. And then the afternoon before the high holidays, I go to the mikvah to say, you know what? The bottom line is we're going to have a holy spiritual experience. And it keeps my focus on that rather than the details of the sermon delivery and the details of the ritual experience. How to use a mikvah? The preparation includes removing clothing, right? Although, for some people, especially if they're doing it in a river, or an ocean, we can say you use baggy clothing. So there's also that liberal, progressive advice to remove makeup, contact lens, everything, and carefully shower prior to immersing. Descend the 7 steps into the water. Immerse fully in the water, followed by reciting a blessing. And typically, there's a mikvah attendant, the same gender, who will observe the immersion to ensure that you go fully underwater. So that's true for conversion, and it's true for Taharat Mishpacha. But if you're using it for alternative contemporary reasons, there's no need to have a mikvah attendant. And usually what they're there for, especially for women, is to make sure all their hair goes under, right? And so every part of your body has to be immersed, completely surrounded by the living waters. All right, we had some Oh, you're not seeing the video. Oh, that's why Laura raised your hand. Good, beautiful. And so here we go, right? And so we go back to the Rav Kahana, and we remember that everything in Judaism is holy. There's nothing in the world void of God. And so that's what we're after in our relationships, in our intimacy, in our entire lives, right? To be guided by the values of Judaism, the values of modesty, respect, honesty, and everything that goes into having a positive, loving, joyful, respectful marriage, and all of our relationships. All right, let's stop there. Any, so Lauren had a comment about the strange Rav Kahana passage. Is that right? Do you want to speak to that, Lauren?
Well, I don't know how old Rav Kahana might have been,